Hi there, I'm Yuval Emek, and I'm going to talk now about communication efficient self-stabilizing leader election as part of DISC 2020. And this is a joint work with Xavier Defago, Shai Kutin, Toshi Matsuzawa, and Yasu Tamura. So I guess that we are all familiar with the leader election problem. Where we are given an undirected graph, and we would like to elect exactly one node as the leader of this graph. In fact, in this paper, we consider a variant of this problem where together with electing the leader, we would also like to construct a spanning tree of the graph rooted at that leader. The computational model we consider is a synchronous message passing, where each node is identified with a processing unit, and it can communicate with its graph neighbors via exchanging messages. We also assume that the execution progresses in synchronous rounds. Now, we would like to develop a self-stabilizing algorithms. These are algorithms that are guaranteed to recover from any combination of transient faults. More formally, we assume that the initial configuration of the algorithm, including all node variables, is determined by a malicious adversary. This adversary knows the algorithm, but is assumed to be oblivious to the algorithm's coin tosses, if any. And then the algorithm should be designed so that it is guaranteed to converge to a valid output from any such initial configuration. This is also known as a stabilization. Now, in most self-stabilization literature, the complexity measure that people consider is the stabilization time. In this paper, however, we focus on the communication overhead of the self-stabilizing algorithm. In particular, we care about the message complexity and the bit complexity of the algorithm. And this turns out to be a little bit tricky when it comes to self-stabilizing algorithms, because such algorithms are required to keep on sending messages indefinitely for the purpose of detecting faults. Which begs the question of how do people measure the communication overhead of a self-stabilizing algorithm? And in fact, there are two approaches for that task. The first one is to look at the pre-stabilization communication overhead. And this is motivated by the fact that a faulty configuration may lead to a heavy communication burst that may cause a system overload. The measure that people use here is simply counting the number of messages or the number of bits that the algorithm sends until it stabilizes. The second approach is to look at the post-stabilization communication overhead. This is motivated because faults tend to be relatively rare, which means that most of the time the algorithm is in a correct configuration. And the measure that people use here is the stabilization bandwidth that have been introduced by, in a seminal paper by Averbuch and Verghese from '91. It is defined as follows. We take tau to be the time until the algorithm stabilizes. And then we define in stabilization bandwidth, we bound the number of messages or the number of bits that the algorithm sends in any time interval of length tau, after the algorithm has stabilized. Okay, what are our results? So first, let's say a few words about assumptions we make. So we assume that the following pieces of information are hard-coded at each node V so that it cannot be modified by the adversary. This includes the size n of the graph, the number of nodes, or a linear approximation of n. It also includes the local topology of the node, so the node knows the edges incident on it. And we also assume that each edge in the graph is identified with a unique identifier of size order log n bits, and that this identifier is known to both endpoints of this edge. This can be thought of as a slightly weaker version of the KT1 model. Now, it is important to emphasize that the adversary can modify any other variable maintained by the algorithm at the initial configuration, and this includes any time measuring variable, and also the incoming messages. So what is our contribution? So we design a randomized self-stabilizing algorithm for the leader election problem that elects a leader node R and constructs a spanning tree T rooted at R. The stabilization time of our algorithm is O tilde of n in expectation and with high probability, whereas as usual, the O tilde notation hides polylogarithmic factors. More importantly, we focus on the communication overhead of the algorithm. Our algorithm uses messages of constant size, which means that asymptotically, the message complexity and the bit complexity are the same. Then we prove that until stabilization, the algorithm sends O tilde of n messages in expectation and with high probability. And after stabilization, the algorithm sends at most one message per round, which means that its stabilization bandwidth is also O tilde of n. Now, by doing so, we, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first algorithm for a classical distributed computing problem that breaks the omega of m barrier, where m is the number of edges, for either the pre-stabilization or the post-stabilization message complexity. And as such, it can be put in the context of the recent works on congest algorithms with a sublinear message complexity, algorithms which are not necessarily self-stabilizing. In fact, we borrow some techniques from those algorithms. Another appealing property of the algorithm is that after stabilization, it only uses the n-1 edges of the spanning tree T for communication. And this is known to be optimal in terms of the number of edges used after stabilization. Okay, let's move on and talk about the algorithm itself. So first of all, each node V maintains a variable called parent, V parent, that points to the parent of V in the tree, and a variable called V children that stores the list of three children of V in the tree. Now we say that, we define the variable T neighbors to be simply the union of the children of V and the parent of V, if any. Now we say that edge VW is compatible if V regard W as its parent in the tree and W regard V as one of its children, or vice versa. And now, since each node has at most one parent, it is easy to see that the set of compatible edges induces an undirected pseudoforest on the graph, as depicted here in this illustration. Now, the algorithm works as follows. First, we want to eliminate all the illegal components of this undirected pseudoforest. And by eliminate a component, I mean that all its nodes become singleton trees. So this component, for example, is illegal because it contains a cycle. So we would like to get rid of it. This component doesn't contain a cycle, but it is also illegal because some of its nodes have three edges which are not compatible. Those are depicted here by the dotted edges. So we also want to get rid of such components. And then we are left with legal components. And for those, the algorithm attempts to merge them over crossing edges, inter tree edges. So we would like to, the algorithm tries to find such crossing edges and then merge the two components over such a crossing edge, forming a larger component. And we keep on repeating it until the whole graph is spanned by a single tree. Okay, the algorithm actually consists of two main building blocks. The first one is a token passing mechanism implemented by means of messages called pass token messages. To this end, each node V maintains the following variables. It has a variable called V token that indicates whether V holds a token or not. It also maintains a variable called V rotor that essentially points to the last tree neighbor of V to which V has passed a token. Now, if node W sends a pass token message M to node V will accept this message only if the following conditions are satisfied. So first of all, we want V to not hold a token currently, so V token should be false. Also, we want the rotor variable of V to point towards W. And we want the edge VW to be compatible. And in order for V to verify that it is indeed compatible, W encodes in a designated field of the message M a bit indicating whether W regard V as a child or as a parent. And using this bit, V can indeed verify that the edge is compatible. Now, if all conditions are satisfied, then V accepts this newly arriving token and sets the token variable to true. Then it holds the token for a constant number of rounds. And following that, it passes the token to some neighbor. So to this end, it advances the rotor variable to the successor W prime of W in its list of tree neighbors. And then it sends a pass token message, conceptually carrying this token to W prime, and resets the V token variable to false, indicating that it no longer holds a token. Now, if any of these conditions is not satisfied, then V simply ignores the message M, which means that the token that this message is carrying is simply lost. And the key thing to notice here is that when V ignores this message, it does not notify W that the message was not received successfully. In fact, it does not notify anyone about it. Okay, so this illustration shows what happens when node V receives a token, this red dot here, from its parent, assuming that the rotor variable points to the parent. So the token is accepted by V. V holds the token for a constant number of rounds. Then it sends it to the next tree neighbor and advances the rotor variable. This repeats again and again and again until eventually the token is sent back to the parent of V. And by now, I guess that it is clear that this mechanism causes the token to traverse the whole tree. But this can be thought of as a DFS traversal of the tree performed by this token. It is fairly trivial to observe, since each node holds the token for a constant number of rounds, that the whole complete traversal of a tree that has k nodes takes order of k rounds. Now, the root, after acquiring the token from its last child, which means that a full traversal has been completed, the root holds this token for a theta of n rounds before starting a new traversal. And by doing so, we ensure that the traversals are spaced apart in time. This will be useful for us later on. Now, this token passing mechanism is actually the primary communication primitive of our algorithm. The algorithm is designed so that any message sent over a tree edge is in fact piggybacked on top of a pass token message, piggybacked with the token. And thinking about it, this allows the root to simulate a broadcast and echo process over its tree using the token passing. Moreover, a node may send an inter-tree message, a message to over an edge that is not a tree edge, only when it holds a token. Okay, the second building block that our algorithm uses is a set of timers. Each node V maintains a V timer variable. This variable is incremented in every round and is reset back to 0 whenever V acquires a token from its parent in the tree. Now, this variable determines if V should call a designated procedure called restart, essentially turning V into a singleton tree. And, this will happen in two occasions. First, if the timer variable of V exceeds a certain linear threshold at any stage of the execution. If this happens, then V restarts. Another, this essentially prevents starvation from the node, not receiving a token for a long time. The second condition for a restart is if V receives a token from its parent, acquires a token from its parent, while its timer is too small. And this is done essentially in order to ensure that a small number of messages are sent also at early stages of the execution. Now, we talked about this restart, turning the node into a singleton tree. This is implemented simply by setting the parent to be bottom, the children to be an empty set, setting the timer to 0, and the token variable to true, indicating that V holds a token. Okay, let's see how we put all those pieces together. So the algorithm is orchestrated by the root of the tree. Each root orchestrates the algorithm in its own tree T. This root partitions the execution into phases, where we actually have phases of two types. Phase can be a proposing phase or an accepting phase. And at the beginning of each phase, the root R determines the phase type by tossing a fair coin. Now, in order to see how those phases work exactly, let's consider the following illustration. We have here two trees. Let's assume that the left tree runs a proposing phase and the right tree runs an accepting phase. So what do we do during the proposing phase? The proposing phase is dedicated to running a procedure called find any that was presented in a paper by Keen, Kuting, and Thorpe from a few years ago. This procedure, it's a fault-free procedure, is guaranteed to find a crossing edge with a positive constant probability if such an edge exists. Now, King et al. Implement this procedure using a constant number of broadcast and echo iterations over the tree, using messages of a logarithmic size. This can obviously be also implemented using a logarithmic number of iterations with broadcast and echo iterations using constant size messages, and therefore we can implement it using order of log n traversals of our tree, piggybacking the broadcast and echo messages over the tokens. So suppose that this proposing tree here ran this find any procedure and found this crossing edge crossing from node X to node Y. So the next thing we do is to transfer the role of the root from the original root down to node X. And this is done in a manner very similar to feature of the seminal algorithm of Gallagher, Umble, and Spira. So we basically shift the root down the tree from its original location to X, together with the token, where we simply reverse the orientation of the edges. And now when the root gets to X, the endpoint of the crossing edge, together with the token, X now sends a merge proposal over this crossing edge, and following that, it waits for a theta of n rounds for an acknowledgement from Y. Meanwhile, the accepting tree during the accepting phase also runs a logarithmic number of traversals. Node Y, while taking part in an accepting phase, records each proposing message it receives, each merge proposal. And this merge proposal will be processed once Y receives the token of its own tree. When this happens, Y sends a designated message to X acknowledging that the merger can take place. And following that, X becomes a child of Y. So the two trees are actually merged together. And the next thing that happens is Y sending the token to X so that the subtree of X will be traversed as part of the traversal of the bigger tree. Okay, let's quickly say a few words about the analysis. So first, this distinction between proposing and accepting phases ensures that whenever two trees are merged together, no cycles can be formed. For the sake of the analysis, we introduce a variable called V delta, defined to be V itself if V holds a token, the V rotor neighbor if the edge between V and V rotor is compatible and V does not hold the token, and bottom otherwise. And now we consider the set of edges, of oriented edges, from V to V delta, as long as V delta is not bottom. And we immediately see that this set of edges induces a pseudoforest on the graph, and we denote this pseudoforest by P delta. So here is an illustration of this pseudoforest, P delta. Now you see that some of the, component of this pseudoforest includes a token if and only if it has a self loop. So any component that has a loop that is not a self loop, that has a cycle which is not a self loop, or doesn't have a cycle at all, cannot hold any token. Moreover, if V passes the token to some neighbor W in its component, and this token passing is successful, then the orientation of the VW edge is reversed, and the self-loop shifts from V to W together with the token. Now we use those basic observations to prove the following key lemma, stating that if a token completes a full traversal of its P delta component, then the component must be good in some sense that I will not explain exactly now. I'll just say that it basically means that this component is guaranteed to survive from now on. We use this lemma to prove that to introduce the fault recovery time TFR, which is some order of n, and prove that from that time onwards, no tokens are lost and no node experiences a restart. Now for the stabilization time, we prove that after the fault recovery time TFR, any phase results in a merge with a positive constant probability. And using that, we show that the stabilization time of the algorithm is order of n log square n in expectation and with high probability. For the pre-stabilization message complexity, we develop a charging scheme under which each node is charged with at most order of one pass token messages in any time interval of linear length. And we also show that the number of pass token messages dominates the number of any other type of messages. This immediately implies that the total number of messages sent by the algorithm before stabilization is also order of n log square n in expectation and with high probability. And for the post-stabilization message complexity, all we have to show is that to observe is that at most one token exists in the algorithm after stabilization, which means that at most, exactly one token exists, which implies that at most one message is sent in any round. Okay, let's conclude. Many self-stabilizing algorithms use what is known as local checking, which basically means that for detecting failures, the nodes indefinitely perform local checking in the local neighborhood. As it is, this local checking requires a lot of communication because each node has to exchange messages with all its neighbors in each round. In our algorithm, in a sense, we implement an implicit local checking by means of this token passing mechanism. And this idea may prove useful in the design of other self-stabilizing algorithms. Now, things that remain open, first of all, we can try to shave some of the logarithmic factors in our bounds. We can try to improve the stabilization time, which is currently linear or near linear in the number of nodes. Perhaps it can be improved to, let's say, something linear in the diameter of the graph or something like that. One may wonder about relaxing the assumption about the knowledge of n, or currently we need to know a linear upper bound of n. We can also try to relax this KT1 assumption, or something that may be harder. Can we get a sublinear message complexity for asynchronous congest self-stabilizing algorithms? And last but not least, I advocate for studying self-stabilizing algorithms also for people who care less about faults. And this is because when we look at self-stabilizing algorithms, we don't need to make any assumptions on the initial configuration of the algorithm. This is, in fact, the definition of self-stabilizing algorithms. And for fault-free algorithms, usually people make relatively strong assumptions on how the algorithm starts. In this way, we can lift those assumptions. So that's it. Thank you very much.